The call came in just after sunrise, when the city was still wrapped in a pale gray silence. A quiet apartment building on the edge of downtown had reported an unresponsive resident. There was no panic in the caller's voice, no screams or urgency, just confusion. That alone made the case unusual. Daniel Harper lived on the 4th floor of the building, in an apartment that overlooked a narrow street lined with leafless trees. He had chosen the place for its privacy. The building was modern, clean, and forgettable, the kind of place where people came and went without ever learning their neighbors' names. Daniel liked it that way. When the police arrived, the hallway was silent. No curious neighbors stood outside their doors. No one whispered or stared. It was as if nothing important had happened at all. The apartment door was locked from the inside. The superintendent used a master key, and when the door opened, the smell inside was neutral. No decay. No chemicals. No smoke. The air felt still, untouched. Daniel Harper was sitting on his living room sofa. At first glance, it looked peaceful. His back rested against the cushion, his head tilted slightly to one side. His hands lay open on his lap. His eyes were closed, and his expression was calm, almost relaxed. If someone didn't know better, they might assume he had fallen asleep while watching television. But the television was off. A ceramic mug sat on the coffee table, filled halfway with tea that had long gone cold. A thin layer of skin had formed on the surface, showing it had been there for hours. A book lay open beside it, a bookmark placed carefully between the pages. Nothing was scattered. Nothing was broken. There were no signs of a struggle. The apartment itself reflected Daniel's personality. Everything had a place. The furniture was minimal and modern. No family photos decorated the walls. No personal items gave clues to his emotions or relationships. It was the home of a man who didn't want to be known. The officers checked his pulse, though they already knew the answer. Daniel Harper was dead. The first shock came when they began examining the body more closely. There were no visible injuries. No cuts. No bruises. No marks on his neck or wrists. His skin showed no discoloration beyond what was expected after death. His clothes were neat, clean, and undisturbed. The medical examiner was called to the scene. She examined Daniel carefully, moving slowly, methodically, as if she expected the body to reveal something if she gave it enough time. But the body revealed nothing. His pupils were normal. His mouth showed no foam or blood. There was no sign of poisoning or suffocation. "This doesn't look like a homicide," one officer said quietly. The medical examiner didn't respond right away. She had learned never to trust first impressions. "It doesn't look like anything," she finally said. That was the problem. As the investigation continued, the apartment was searched inch by inch. Drawers were opened. Cabinets were checked. Trash bins were examined. The bathroom showed no signs of forced vomiting or drug use. The bedroom was perfectly made, as if Daniel had never slept there the night before. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong to Daniel. No smudges. No partial prints. Every surface looked as though it had been wiped down, but there was no sign of cleaning chemicals. It was simply empty. The windows were locked from the inside. The balcony door was sealed. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact and undamaged. Security footage from the building was pulled immediately. Cameras covered the entrance, the elevator, and the hallways. But on the night Daniel died, the cameras outside his floor had stopped recording for exactly 43 minutes. The official reason was a system malfunction. 43 minutes was all it took. No one was seen entering or leaving Daniel's apartment during that window. No suspicious movement. No unknown faces. The footage before and after showed nothing unusual. Daniel Harper had vanished into death without being touched. The medical examiner ordered a full autopsy. The results only deepened the mystery. Daniel's heart had stopped suddenly, but there was no sign of a heart attack. His arteries were clear. His organs were healthy. He had no known medical conditions. Toxicology tests showed no drugs, no alcohol, no poison. His blood was clean. There was no cause of death. For investigators, this was a nightmare. Every murder left something behind. Even the most careful killers made mistakes. A fiber. A footprint. A drop of sweat. But here, There was nothing. The case was officially classified as a suspicious death. Word spread quickly. The media picked up the story within hours. Headlines described a man found dead in a locked apartment with no cause of death. Commentators speculated wildly. Some suggested natural causes that science had yet to explain. Others hinted at something darker. People didn't like mysteries without answers. Detectives began building a timeline of Daniel's final day. He had gone to work as usual. Coworkers said he seemed normal, though distant. He had eaten lunch alone at a cafe he visited often. The cashier remembered him because he always paid in exact change and never made small talk. He returned home around 7:10 p.m., according to the building's entrance camera. He was alone. He didn't appear nervous or rushed. He nodded at the camera, a habit he had developed over the years, and entered the elevator. That was the last time anyone saw Daniel Harper alive. Phone records showed no calls after 7:22 p.m. No messages. No emails. His phone battery was still half full when it was found. There were no signs of distress. The police interviewed neighbors, but no one reported hearing anything unusual. No screams. No loud noises. No arguments. One neighbor mentioned hearing a faint humming sound late that night, but dismissed it as street noise or construction equipment in the distance. That comment was noted, then forgotten. As the day ended, the apartment was sealed, and Daniel's body was taken away. The living room looked exactly the same as when it was first discovered. Peaceful. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Experienced officers felt uneasy. Death rarely looked this clean. This controlled. This intentional. Someone had been there. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. And whatever had killed Daniel Harper had done so without leaving a single physical trace behind. By the time night fell, one thing was certain. This was not an accident. It was the beginning of a case that would haunt everyone involved, because it challenged the most basic belief in criminal investigation, that every crime leaves evidence. In Daniel Harper's apartment, there was only silence. And silence can be the loudest clue of all. When Detective Laura Mitchell first opened Daniel Harper's file, she expected the usual pattern. A circle of friends. A strained relationship or two. A hidden habit that had spiraled out of control. Most deaths, even mysterious ones, followed a human trail that eventually led somewhere solid. Daniel's file did not. It felt thin, empty, like it had been cleaned before it ever reached her desk. Laura had learned over the years that silence in a case often meant secrets. Daniel Harper had lived quietly, but quiet lives still left noise behind if someone knew how to listen. Her first stop was Daniel's workplace, a private financial consulting firm located in a glass building downtown. The office was bright, modern, and filled with people who spoke in careful tones. When Laura introduced herself, conversations lowered immediately. Daniel's death had already reached them, but no one seemed openly shaken by it. His supervisor described Daniel as reliable and efficient. He arrived on time, left on time, and rarely socialized. He was known for working independently, often requesting files be sent digitally rather than meeting clients in person. He produced results, and in their business, results mattered more than personality. Laura spoke to Daniel's co-workers one by one. Most said the same thing. He was polite but distant, helpful but cold. He never raised his voice, never joked, never complained. People trusted him with sensitive financial information, yet no one truly knew him. That bothered Laura. People who lived carefully often had reasons for doing so. She requested a list of Daniel's past clients. It was long, filled with names that had once trusted him with their livelihoods. As she began making calls, a different image of Daniel slowly emerged. One former client spoke angrily about a business collapse that had followed Daniel's advice. He claimed Daniel had pushed him toward risky investments while secretly protecting his own interests. Another client described feeling manipulated, guided into decisions that benefited Daniel in ways that were never explained clearly. None of it was illegal. Not on paper. But there was a pattern. People felt used. Outplayed. Discarded. Laura realized Daniel's enemies weren't loud or obvious. They were quiet and embarrassed, carrying resentment they never spoke about openly. The next piece of Daniel's life was his marriage. Emily Harper lived in a small house outside the city. When Laura knocked on her door, Emily took a long moment before opening it. She looked tired, older than her age, as if stress had carved itself into her face over time. When Laura explained why she was there, Emily didn't seem surprised. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly. Emily described Daniel as controlled, intelligent, and emotionally distant. He never hit her, never shouted, never threatened her. But he watched everything. He measured words, reactions, silence. Living with him felt like being constantly evaluated. Their marriage ended suddenly after Daniel accused Emily of financial irresponsibility. He filed for divorce and walked away without argument. Within weeks, he had moved into his apartment and cut off nearly all contact. When Laura asked if Emily thought someone wanted Daniel dead, Emily hesitated. "Daniel made people feel small," she finally said. "He never had to raise his voice. He just knew how to take things from people and make them believe it was their fault." Emily had no alibi issues, no motive that crossed into violence. But her words added depth to the picture. Daniel didn't just make enemies. He collected them. Laura then turned her attention to Marcus Reed. Marcus had worked as Daniel's personal assistant for 5 years. He handled schedules, documents, and client communications. According to company records, Marcus had been fired without warning 2 months before Daniel's death. Laura found Marcus living in a modest apartment, neat but sparsely furnished. He welcomed her calmly. Offering coffee she politely declined. Marcus spoke carefully, choosing each word as though it might later be played back in a courtroom. He said Daniel fired him after accusing him of making accounting errors. Errors Marcus insisted were not his fault. After the dismissal, Marcus struggled to find work. His professional reputation had been damaged quietly, without explanation. "Daniel didn't need to accuse me loudly," Marcus said. "He just had to suggest doubt." Laura asked if Marcus was angry. "Of course," he replied. "But anger doesn't make someone a killer." Marcus claimed he hadn't seen Daniel since the firing. Phone records supported that. There were no threatening messages, no confrontations, just distance. As Laura left Marcus's apartment, she felt uneasy. He was cooperative, controlled, and almost too understanding of the investigation. He didn't display grief. But he didn't display rage either. Back at the station, Laura began piecing together Daniel's digital life. His emails were clean, professional, short, no emotional language. His messages to clients were polite but firm, always pushing decisions forward. His browser history revealed late-night research into stress disorders, neurological responses, and unusual sound therapy experiments. The searches were detailed, technical, repeated. That raised questions. Why would a man with no medical background research something so specific? Laura requested Daniel's financial records. Everything appeared legal, but money moved in strange ways. Small amounts transferred frequently between accounts, never large enough to draw attention. It was careful, organized. Daniel lived modestly for someone with his income. He didn't travel much. He didn't spend excessively. It was as if wealth wasn't his goal. Control was. As Laura continued her investigation, she noticed something unsettling. No one mourned Daniel deeply. Coworkers spoke respectfully, but without sadness. Clients expressed frustration rather than grief. Even Emily seemed relieved rather than heartbroken. Daniel Harper had lived among people, but never with them. Yet Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Someone whose presence hadn't been documented. Someone who didn't appear in emails or financial records. She reviewed Daniel's last week again. No unusual meetings. No threats. No signs of fear, except one small detail. 2 days before his death, Daniel had emailed his building manager asking about security camera maintenance. He asked how often the cameras were checked and what happened if they stopped working. It was a strange question. Why would Daniel worry about cameras unless he believed something might happen? Or unless he knew something was already planned? Laura stayed at the email for a long time. Daniel Harper had lived a life of quiet control, surrounded by people who felt harmed but powerless. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't leave bruises. Yet he changed lives in ways that left damage behind. And now he was dead in a locked apartment, with no evidence of how or why. Laura closed the file slowly. This wasn't a crime driven by passion or chaos. It was precise, personal, calculated. Whoever had done this didn't want revenge to be seen. They wanted it to be perfect. And somewhere within Daniel's carefully managed life, the reason for his death was hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. By the third week of the investigation, the Daniel Harper case had begun to rot from the inside. Not because of corruption or neglect, but because it refused to behave like a crime. There was no murder weapon to photograph, no bloodstains to analyze, no suspect to circle in red on a board. The case file sat on Detective Laura Mitchell's desk like an accusation, daring her to admit defeat. Laura had seen difficult cases before. She had seen killers hide bodies, burn evidence, flee across borders. But this was different. This crime hadn't been hidden. It had been displayed openly, calmly, almost politely. A man dead in his own living room, waiting to be discovered. The autopsy report arrived with little fanfare and even less comfort. Cause of death, undetermined. That single word haunted Laura. Undetermined meant unanswered. It meant that science, which usually provided at least a direction, had failed to point anywhere at all. Still, Laura refused to let it end there. She requested a second autopsy, this time involving a broader forensic team. Specialists from neurology, audiology, and environmental medicine were brought in. The body was examined again, this time not for obvious signs of violence, but for subtle disruptions. Anything abnormal. Anything that felt out of place. 4 days, nothing emerged. Then a junior forensic specialist named Hannah Cole noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. Hannah wasn't experienced enough to assume she knew what was important, which made her dangerous in the best possible way. She didn't dismiss tiny details as meaningless. While reviewing microscopic tissue scans, she noticed faint internal trauma near the auditory canal and upper throat. It wasn't damage in the traditional sense. There were no tears or bruises, just cellular stress, like tissue that had been subjected to intense pressure for a brief moment. Hannah brought the finding to the medical examiner, who frowned and asked her to double-check. She did. The result was the same. The marks were too small to indicate assault and too inconsistent to suggest natural causes. They didn't align with poisoning, suffocation, or cardiac failure. They aligned with something else. Something rare. Laura was called in immediately. The forensic team explained carefully, choosing their words as if afraid to sound ridiculous. There existed documented cases, mostly experimental and rarely discussed, involving extreme sound exposure. Not audible noise, but focused low-frequency and high-frequency sound waves capable of disrupting neurological function. In controlled conditions, such sound could disorient, paralyze, and in rare cases, interfere with heart rhythm. It was not common. It was not easy. But it was possible. The idea felt unreal, almost cinematic. Laura wanted to dismiss it. Murder by sound sounded like something pulled from fiction, not a real investigation. But then the pieces began to align. No struggle. No poison. No physical contact. No evidence left behind. Sound didn't leave fingerprints. It didn't shed fibers. It didn't carry DNA. Once it stopped, it vanished completely. Laura felt a chill settle into her spine. The team explained that such sound, if focused correctly and delivered at close range or through certain structural pathways, could overwhelm the body in seconds. The heart could stop without warning. The nervous system could shut down without visible trauma. And unless someone knew exactly what to look for, it would be missed entirely. Laura thought of the neighbor's statement about the faint humming noise. The details she had skimmed past without interest. She pulled the report again and reread it slowly. A hum. Not loud enough to alarm. Not sharp enough to be remembered clearly. Just strange enough to exist. The theory demanded another question. Who would know about something like this? Laura returned to Daniel Harper's digital footprint with renewed focus. This time, she didn't just look at what he searched for, but when. The timestamps told a story that had gone unnoticed. Daniel had begun researching neurological sound effects 3 months before his death. Not casually. Not once or twice. He read scientific journals, obscure research papers, and experimental studies. He searched for phrases like non-lethal sound exposure and cardiac disruption frequencies. This wasn't curiosity. It was fear. Daniel had known something. Laura imagined Daniel alone in his apartment at night, reading about invisible threats, about ways the human body could be shut down without a single touch. She wondered what had driven him there. A threat? A warning? Or a realization that someone around him had knowledge he shouldn't possess? Then came the most disturbing discovery. In the final week of his life, Daniel had searched for ways to block sound. He looked into noise-canceling materials, soundproofing techniques, and ear protection designed for extreme environments. Yet his apartment showed no signs of soundproofing. No equipment. No protection. It was as if he had run out of time. Laura sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. For the first time since the case began, the silence around Daniel's death felt deliberate rather than empty. She called Hannah and asked her a simple question. If someone wanted to do this, Laura said, what would they need? Hannah hesitated before answering. Knowledge, precision, and access, she said. Not physical access. Proximity. That word stayed with Laura. Proximity. The killer wouldn't need to enter the apartment. They wouldn't need to touch Daniel. They would only need to be close enough, for long enough, at the right moment. Laura ordered a structural analysis of the building. Engineers examined the walls, floors, and ventilation systems. They found that sound traveled unusually well through the building's framework, especially through shared walls and air ducts. Daniel's living room shared a wall with the neighboring apartment. Laura pulled the building records. That apartment had been vacant during the night of Daniel's death, listed as temporarily unoccupied due to maintenance. The tenant had moved out weeks earlier, but someone could still enter it. Someone with access. Someone unnoticed. The investigation took on a new intensity. Laura re-interviewed the building manager, pressing harder this time. He admitted that several former tenants still had copies of their keys, something management had been slow to address. Laura felt the net tightening. But still, there was no device. No equipment. No physical proof that sound had been used as a weapon. Without that, everything remained theory. Then another unsettling realization struck her. If Daniel knew he was being targeted by something invisible, why hadn't he gone to the police? The answer came slowly, painfully. Daniel Harper didn't trust institutions. He believed in systems, but only ones he controlled. Going to the police would have meant admitting vulnerability. It would have meant admitting fear. Daniel didn't do fear. Instead, he researched. He prepared. He tried to understand the thing that was coming for him. And he failed. Laura reviewed Daniel's final evening again. He returned home calmly. No panic. No phone calls. No messages asking for help. Maybe he didn't know the exact moment it would happen. Or maybe he had already accepted that he couldn't stop it. That thought unsettled Laura more than any theory. Because it suggested something intimate. Something personal. The killer hadn't acted out of rage. They hadn't rushed. They hadn't improvised. They had waited. They had studied Daniel the way Daniel studied others. And when the moment came, they used a method so clean, so precise, that it erased itself the instant it was finished. By the end of the week, Laura understood something terrifying. If this theory was correct, then Daniel Harper had been murdered by someone who knew him well enough to predict his behavior, his routines, and his final moments. Someone who didn't need to be seen. Someone who understood that the most effective weapon was one that left nothing behind. The question was no longer how Daniel died. The question was who had learned to kill without ever laying a hand on their victim, and whether that person was still watching. By the time Detective Laura Mitchell reached the fourth phase of the investigation, the Daniel Harper case no longer felt like a puzzle. It felt like a trap. Every answer led to another question, and every question seemed designed to dissolve before it could fully form. Still, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Daniel Harper had not died naturally. Someone had killed him with intention, patience, and frightening intelligence. Laura returned to the list of people closest to Daniel, not looking for anger this time, but for opportunity. She reviewed schedules, locations, habits, and proximity. If sound had been used as a weapon, then distance mattered. Timing mattered. Position mattered. That was when one name began to rise above the others, not because it stood out, but because it had been hiding in plain sight from the beginning. Marcus Reed. Laura had already interviewed him once. He had been cooperative, calm, and almost detached. At the time, she had seen that as a sign of innocence. Now, she wasn't so sure. She pulled Marcus's file again and read it slowly, without assumptions, without the comfort of first impressions. Marcus Reed had worked closely with Daniel for 5 years. He knew Daniel's routines better than anyone. He scheduled his meetings, organized his documents, and had access to his personal calendar. He knew when Daniel was alone, when he was busy, and when he was most vulnerable. Laura revisited the circumstances of Marcus's dismissal. Daniel had fired him abruptly, accusing him of financial errors that were never formally investigated. Marcus's reputation had suffered quietly, exactly the way Daniel's influence worked. No confrontation, no explanation, just doubt planted where trust once existed. Laura requested Marcus's full employment history. That was when she found it. Before becoming Daniel's assistant, Marcus had studied audio engineering. Not casually, not as a hobby. He had completed advanced coursework in sound design, frequency modulation, and acoustic environments. He had even worked briefly on experimental audio projects involving human perception. He had never mentioned this background to Daniel's firm. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She ordered a second interview. Marcus greeted her with the same calm politeness as before. His apartment was unchanged. Clean. Minimal. Quiet. Too quiet. Laura noticed the thick curtains drawn across the windows despite it being midday. The room felt sealed, insulated. She asked Marcus about his education. He smiled slightly and admitted he had studied audio engineering years ago, but claimed it had never been relevant to his job. He said he left the field because it didn't offer stable work. His explanation was reasonable, plausible. Laura pressed further. She asked him if he knew anything about sound frequencies affecting the human body. Marcus paused for half a second. Not long enough for most people to notice, but Laura noticed everything. "I've read about it," he said. "Mostly theoretical." That answer stayed with her. Theoretical. Marcus wasn't surprised by the concept. He wasn't confused. He wasn't skeptical. He accepted it easily, as if it were already familiar territory. Laura left the apartment with a growing sense of unease. She began tracking Marcus's movements on the night Daniel died. His phone records placed him at home all evening. No calls. No messages. No location changes. A perfect alibi. Too perfect. Laura checked the building layouts again. Marcus lived directly across the street from Daniel's apartment building. From his living room window, Daniel's living room was visible. The distance wasn't large, and sound didn't require touch. Laura stood outside Marcus's building late one evening, watching the lights flicker on in Daniel's old apartment across the street. She imagined the night of the murder, the silence, the timing. A man sitting alone, unaware that something invisible was being aimed at him. She wondered how long it would take. Seconds. Minutes. Just long enough. Laura obtained a warrant to search Marcus's apartment again, this time with a broader scope. The search turned up nothing obvious. No strange devices. No wiring. No equipment that looked remotely suspicious. But Marcus's computer told a different story. Deleted files were recovered with effort. Research notes. Diagrams. Frequency charts. All erased carefully, but not perfectly. Marcus had studied sound in ways that aligned disturbingly well with the forensic theory. Still, none of it proved murder. Knowledge was not a crime. Laura needed more. She began speaking to people Marcus had known before Daniel. Former classmates. Old colleagues. A pattern emerged that felt uncomfortably familiar. Marcus was described as intelligent, reserved, and deeply sensitive to injustice. He believed systems punished the wrong people and rewarded the wrong behavior. He wasn't violent. He wasn't aggressive. But he remembered slights. He remembered betrayals. Daniel Harper hadn't just fired Marcus. He had destroyed his future quietly, the same way he destroyed clients and controlled his marriage. Daniel had believed that because he didn't raise his voice, because he didn't leave bruises, he was blameless. Marcus saw it differently. Laura realized something chilling. Marcus didn't want Daniel to suffer physically. He wanted Daniel to dissipate. He wanted the world to look at Daniel's death and shrug. No trial. No justice. No recognition of wrongdoing. The same silence Daniel had used against others. The investigation intensified, but the case began to attract attention from higher authorities. Prosecutors grew nervous. They wanted certainty, evidence that could survive courtrooms and scrutiny. Laura had theories, patterns, logic. What she didn't have was a weapon. No device had been found. No witness had heard enough. No recording existed. Marcus denied everything calmly, repeatedly, and convincingly. Then Laura noticed something small but devastating. Marcus's apartment had undergone renovations shortly after Daniel's death. New insulation, new wall panels, old materials disposed of through a private contractor. Completely legal, completely untraceable. Any device, if it had existed, was gone. Laura felt the case slipping through her fingers. She confronted Marcus one final time, not with accusations, but with understanding. "You know he ruined people," she said quietly. "You know he never paid for it." Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Some people never pay," he replied. "They just stop." That was all he said. It wasn't a confession. It didn't need to be. The prosecutors reviewed the evidence and declined to file charges. The case relied too heavily on theory. No physical proof tied Marcus to the death. No device. No undeniable link. The file was marked unsolved. Laura closed it with a sense of failure she couldn't shake. She knew what had happened. She knew who had done it. But knowing didn't matter if the truth couldn't stand on its own. Marcus Reed moved away 3 months later. He changed his name. He left no forwarding address. He vanished as quietly as Daniel had lived. And somewhere in that silence, Laura understood the final cruelty of the crime. The killer hadn't just taken a life. He had taken certainty itself. He had proven that a person could be destroyed without being touched, without being seen, and without ever being held accountable. Daniel Harper had believed control made him untouchable. Marcus Reed proved him wrong. Not with violence, but with precision, and the knowledge that some crimes are designed not to be solved, but to be understood only by the people who lived through them. The Daniel Harper case did not end with a dramatic arrest or a courtroom confession. It ended quietly, the way Daniel Harper had lived and the way he had died. One afternoon, without ceremony, Detective Laura Mitchell received the official notice that the investigation was being closed. The language was careful and cold. No further actionable leads. Insufficient evidence to proceed. Cause of death undetermined. Laura stayed at the document for a long time before placing it back in the folder. She had known this moment was coming, yet it still felt like a personal failure. Not because she lacked effort, but because the truth had slipped just far enough away to remain unreachable. The case file was thick now, filled with interviews, forensic reports, technical theories, and unanswered questions. Yet none of it could cross the final line from suspicion to proof. Without physical evidence, the justice system had nothing to hold on to. The law demanded something tangible, something visible. This case offered only silence. The media reacted predictably. The story that once dominated headlines faded into a brief update. The mysterious death of Daniel Harper was ruled inconclusive. Speculation continued in comment sections and late-night discussions, but without new developments, public interest slowly died. Mystery alone was not enough to sustain outrage. Daniel Harper became a footnote. Laura attended the closing meeting with prosecutors and senior officials. The room was quiet, professional, emotionally distant. They spoke of legal thresholds, reasonable doubt, and the dangers of pursuing cases built on unproven methods. Laura listened, understanding every argument, yet accepting none of them emotionally. She argued that patterns mattered. That opportunity mattered. That knowledge mattered. But law did not operate on intuition. It operated on certainty. When the meeting ended, no one lingered. Laura returned to her desk and began organizing the case one final time. She reread every report, every interview transcript, every note she had written during long nights fueled by coffee and stubborn belief. The theory still held. Every piece fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. But the absence of evidence was absolute. She thought about Daniel Harper again, not as a victim, but as a man. A man who believed he could shape outcomes without consequence. A man who hurt others quietly, strategically, and without accountability. His death mirrored his life in a way that felt almost poetic. Laura wondered if Daniel had understood that in his final moments. Sitting on his sofa, tea cooling beside him, reading a book he would never finish. Had he sensed something was wrong? Had he felt the sudden pressure, the invisible force overwhelming his body? Or had it happened too quickly for awareness? That question haunted her more than any other. In the weeks that followed, Laura tried to move on to new cases. She solved other crimes. She arrested people who left fingerprints, DNA, weapons, and witnesses behind. Crimes that followed familiar rules. Crimes that made sense. But Daniel Harper's case stayed with her. Sometimes late at night, she found herself reopening the file, staring at Marcus Reed's photograph. His calm eyes. His neutral expression. A man who had never been officially accused, never charged, never punished. Marcus Reed had vanished from the city not long after the case was closed. He had sold his apartment, canceled his utilities, and legally changed his name. He hadn't fled. He hadn't hidden. He had simply erased himself, step by step, using legal systems designed to protect privacy. Laura followed his trail as far as she could. It ended cleanly. No records. No sightings. No mistakes. It was as if Marcus Reed had never existed. That realization forced Laura to confront an uncomfortable truth. The crime had succeeded not just because of intelligence or planning, but because it exploited the limits of justice itself. The system was built to punish visible harm. It struggled with harm that left no mark. Daniel Harper's death exposed a blind spot. The forensic theory was never officially acknowledged. It remained buried in internal reports and academic speculation. No department wanted to publicly admit that murder could occur without physical evidence. Such an admission would raise questions no one wanted to answer. What other deaths had been misclassified? What other crimes had passed unnoticed? Laura's frustration slowly transformed into something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps. Or resignation. She stopped chasing Marcus Reed and began focusing on preventing future cases like Daniel's. She pushed for better interdisciplinary cooperation, for forensic training that looked beyond traditional violence. Her suggestions were met with polite interest and slow implementation. Change, she learned, moved at its own pace. Years passed. Daniel Harper's apartment was rented out again. New tenants moved in, unaware of the history within those walls. The living room was repainted, the furniture replaced, the silence absorbed into everyday life. Life went on. Sometimes Laura wondered if Marcus Reed ever thought about Daniel again. If he felt satisfaction or emptiness. If he believed what he had done was justice, or simply balance restored. She suspected Marcus believed he had done nothing wrong. That was the most frightening part. This was not a crime born of chaos or impulse. It was not driven by hatred alone. It was driven by belief. The belief that some people deserved to be removed, not punished. Erased, not confronted. That belief was powerful. And dangerous. Laura retired from the force 8 years later. On her last day, she cleaned out her desk and found Daniel Harper's case file tucked at the back of a drawer. She hadn't realized she kept it. She held the folder for a long time before finally placing it in a box marked personal. At home that evening, she sat alone and opened it one last time. She read the first report describing the peaceful crime scene. The undetermined cause of death. The early confusion. She read the final report closing the case without resolution. Nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Laura understood now that some cases were never meant to be solved in the traditional sense. Some existed to reveal flaws, to expose uncomfortable realities about the world and the systems meant to protect it. Daniel Harper's case was one of them. The killer had walked free, not because he was innocent, but because he was careful. Because he understood that the most effective crimes were those that challenged belief rather than evidence. There was no dramatic ending. No justice served. Only a lesson that lingered in the silence left behind. A man had been killed without being touched. A crime had been committed without leaving proof. and the truth had survived only in the mind of one detective who would never forget it. In the end, the most disturbing part of the story was not that a killer escaped punishment. It was that the world accepted it and moved on. And somewhere out there, a person who knew how to kill without leaving evidence continued living an ordinary life, unseen, unremarkable, and unaccountable. That was the real horror. Not the crime itself, but the certainty that it could happen again.